Well, good morning to our organizers and hosts, to our fellow speakers, and also to the ladies and gentlemen in the audience. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for having me over to talk about something that is what I do day in and day out, which is focus on the country's economy. So I look after economics and finance at Niti Aayog. And over there, since the Prime Minister announced his plan of a $5 trillion economy without giving necessarily all the levers to get there almost a year ago, it's been a very, very interesting time in figuring out how we will get there. The basic framework that the Niti Aayog looked at for getting to that plan was to see that what really has been the historical growth rate of India. And based on looking at what India has grown at in the most recent past, the past 10 to 15 years, what we found is that it's not really a stretch for us to be becoming a $5 trillion economy in these 5 years based on that. However, we're looking at a world which is different from the world that we've had in the past 15 or 20 years. As I think other speakers have pointed out, the global economy has slowed. The second thing that people have pointed out is that people are becoming more risk averse. And the third thing that I think people have not pointed out today, but is very relevant, is the fact that global trade barriers are rising right now after coming down for many, many years. So in that environment, we said we have to look at what we can do and what is in India's control to be achieving the targets that the Government of India, or actually the Prime Minister of India, has set for us. So first of all, let's look at the math. What is that math that is required in terms of growth rates for us to get to be a $5 trillion economy in 5 years? So one was a definitional issue. When he said 5 years, he didn't say fiscal year 24 or 25. So in the spirit of everyone in India trying to set the benchmark low, everyone assumed it was fiscal year 25. So we will go with that assumption. So it gives us a little more room to get to that $5 trillion. And looking at fiscal year 25 and a $5 trillion economy then, it suggests with a 4% inflation rate that we actually require real growth of 8.5% a year for the remaining 4 years. 1 year has gone by. And nominal growth of about 12.5%. In the past 15 to 20 years, we have done that almost half the time. So it doesn't appear to be that much of a stretch, in fact, over half the time. But given what we heard about this first year from our finance minister yesterday, which is a growth rate that is significantly below that 8.5, it makes one wonder why things are going to be improving going forward and whether that target, yesterday I don't think anyone talked about the $5 trillion economy during the budget. And even during the Q&A sessions that surrounded it, everyone was very focused on the budget. Whether with this 6% that is being forecast, which is more optimistic than some of the multilateral agencies, how could we get there? And I think that's where the topic for today's discussion actually steps in when we talk about the digital economy. Because as has been pointed out by other speakers earlier this morning, what has happened in the past 5.5 years has actually been a lot of foundation building. And this foundation, a very significant portion of this foundation, has been on the digital landscape and what I would call inclusion, digital inclusion. And digital inclusion is a very, very, I would say, a very strong foundation for beginning to accelerate economic growth. And I'll walk you through the reasons why. The most important reason that, first in terms of the numbers, we have seen the penetration of bank accounts explode. We have watched the the JAM Trinity, what they call the Jan Dhan, the Aadhaar, and mobility actually take off and get to penetrations that are extremely high. All of this has happened in the past 5 years, and we have watched the cleanup of the banks, a system which wasn't really functioning very well in terms of recognizing NPAs and seeing how much capital there was to be dispersing over the past 5.5, 6 years. In fact, it's taken longer than that. And there's a price you pay for these. When you talk about credit growth decelerating from 25% all the way down to now mid-single digits, that is definitely not accelerating the economy, that's slowing it down. But that was part of what I would call the cleanup process, where we needed to get, loans that were getting evergreened, loans that people have called, phone loans or phone banking of a different sort from the phone banking that you have in other countries around the world. But that cleanup is now over. The vast majority of the NPAs have now been recognized. Of course, there may be new NPAs as the economy, if it deteriorates. But from that perspective now, when you're seeing green shoots in the economy, this is based on real numbers and based on real credit and understanding the financial sector much better. Now, why was digital so important? Because it's now provided, much, much better metrics and a much better, what I would say, machinery for delivering much higher quality credit without resorting to what they call that phone credit that used to exist previously. So, as a speaker has said, our first speaker of today, the Honorable Rajya Sabha member MP, he said that in this country, very, very few people are honest, and he was asking how many people are paying their taxes, and that answer was very, very small. Since 2017 or 2016, the number of people paying or filing taxes has actually increased by about 70%. It's still a small number, but that tells you the runway. When you go to get a bank loan or you go to get a loan anywhere, interestingly, people will look at your track record before they will extend you credit. So formalization of the economy is a very, very important part of helping the economy, understanding the economy, and also figuring out how we can help it accelerate. So that formalization, when you're talking about the increase in the number of income tax returns, not just from a tax perspective, you'll be happy to know that less than half the people, or maybe not happy to know, but interested to know, that more than half the people that file tax returns, or almost half the people, barely pay any taxes. They file those returns because otherwise the TDS that's been deducted, they won't get it back. But it's still good news because once they're part of the formal system, you actually know how much money is going through the economy, how much people are making, and it's a good beginning. I think it's still less than 6% of the country pays or files income taxes, and a smaller number than that, 6 or 7% do that, and a much smaller number than that actually is paying the taxes because they get these reimbursements. The second big move in terms of this formalization and digitization about a digital economy was GST. And GST has been massive. It's been disruptive, like the move that actually created even all these higher returns. GST also has been fairly disruptive because it is a massive change in the system. But what GST has done, it's enabled the economy, one, to start working much more efficiently. And you will see that the long lines that used to happen at state borders are no longer happening, as now there's a single unified tax. You don't have to stop at every border and pay it. So the amount of time to go from the top of the country to the bottom of the country has shrunk drastically. It is also the quality of roads that's improved in the past 5 to 6 years. But it is also fundamentally the fact that those border stoppings have now gotten much shorter, and also the country's market has become a larger market. I think other speakers have talked about how unity is strength. One of the biggest reasons why the ASEAN countries have done very well is because they've learned to work very well together. The same thing has happened if you look at the European Union. They came together to counteract the massive market that the United States provides. All these states without any borders. And so for India, it was very important to get the efficiencies of our scale by allowing greater mobility between the states and making the rules and laws, especially in the tax front, uniform. When you have a massive change like this, there is disruption. But the huge advantages that come from it are not just restricted to the efficiencies of a new market. From a formalization perspective and talking about the digital economy, it also started providing a very, very good new metric for banks to be giving money, or other NBFCs to be giving money, to what was otherwise a very informal economy. And that is, you have GST filings that record actual revenue. It's not a number you're putting on a sheet of paper, but you actually have hard numbers. You're tracking the growth rates. You have your number from last year. The GST came in the middle of 2017. By now, you have a track record of almost 2.5 years. And as time goes by, usually for credit, people look at 3-year track records. So now you're watching more and more data, more and more track record, more and more about the digital economy becoming visible to people for that potential credit. So that's why I would say that the big cleanup and foundation building has been done. You have the JAM Trinity that has given everyone a unique identifier. You have a mobile phone that is connected, with that. And you have a bank account, the Jan Dhan for the vast majority. And that is the fundamental foundation on which you can push the credit. We've also cleaned up the banks at huge cost to the country's economic growth. When the growth of credit goes down from 25% to like 7-8%, that means that the economy, the amount of total credit, when you look at the banking system, it's about numerically equal to about half GDP. That 1,600 basis points drop means it was an 8% headwind to economic growth. And we have still managed to deliver in the past 5 years about 7% growth on average, despite this deceleration, which tells you that the strength of the broader Indian economy is actually very high. So I would encourage everyone now, rather than be discouraged by the most recent growth rate, to look at that whole foundation, especially investors, not just foreign investors that we are trying to make things friendlier for, because we are still a $2,000 per capita GDP country. Our domestic savings are still very limited, but also the Indian investors that have gotten a little scared by looking at this slowdown, to actually start getting more optimistic and make use of this new formal economy and start investing in it. So with that, I think, that will sort of lay the broad framework for, I think, what the digital economy means to us at Niti Aayog, what it could mean going forward now that you have a huge formalization that's happened in the past 2.5 years. At the 3-year mark is when historically you start watching the benefits of rising credit. We also have the lowest private credit and total credit. People are very focused on government credit as a percentage of GDP, which is high for India at about 73%, and the FRBM is trying to bring it down to 60% over time. But when you look at total credit and when you look at your private credit, out of the G20, we are the lowest as a percentage of GDP. So we have a fantastic runway to provide stimulus through rising credit, but rather than the inefficient phone banking where you start watching things like happened with the power sector and what happened with the steel sector getting overcapitalized in this phone banking, you're actually going to watch it much more broad-based. If you see the private credit that's been growing at the household level and the individual level, personal loan level, has been very robust even these 5 to 7 years. And that is actually going to become a much, much stronger driver of the growth going forward than has been historical. The last point I'll touch on before we move on to the next speaker is what we're trying to do with your strategic disinvestment. So a lot of focus yesterday was looking at that, the fiscal deficit, looking at what revenue is and what expenditure is and the trade-off between these three things. A lot less focus was on what they call non-tax revenue for the government. And non-tax revenue for the government is comprised of multiple things, but one of the more important areas that Niti Aayog is focused on would be 2 areas. One would be what they call strategic disinvestment, and the second is what we call asset monetization and asset recycling. Both of these are very different things. So asset monetization and asset recycling is just trying to make public assets far more productive. So assets that are lying there are not getting utilized much more. Rather than rolling out new assets with fiscal help and getting money from the government to invest it, the focus is on ensuring that what has already been created and has low project risk. Whenever you borrow for a project, the risk is higher, so the cost of capital is higher. But a finished project, whether it's a road, whether it's power lines, whether it's gas lines, whether it's many finished projects, it's to take those assets that are already finished, monetize them, give them to investors, because it'll be a much lower cost of capital than for new projects where you can have interruptions in between that increases the cost of the project, and take that money and the government invests it in these riskier things, which investors are not as willing to take at the same price. So that is the asset monetization side. But when you look at an asset recycling also, But when you look at strategic disinvestment, it's a very different thought. It is looking at what percentage of this economy is government controlled. And interestingly, it's between 40 to 50% of this economy that is directly controlled by the government. And the government, even well-run companies in the government, for example, the Shipping Corporation of India, when you look at many other companies that are very efficient, not all companies in the government are inefficient, there is still an issue with two factors. One is that the decision-making of a government company, there's due process that needs to be followed. In many industries, we cannot move as fast as a marketplace is moving. Decision-making has to be significantly faster. You've got to come up with responses. And the checks and balances and the due procedure for companies that belong in the government actually slows down that. Now, a decision, if you look at just the same decision and growth and investment happening over a 2-year period instead of a 6-month period or 3-month period, you can imagine how much that slows the economy. And with 47% of the economy being sort of government linked and decision controlled, not just the direct expenditure, but also looking at the state and the central level, but also looking at all the public sector units, which might have public shareholding, but the decision making is still done through the government process. That slows things down. So there was a decision taken before I joined Niti Aayog to strategically disinvest whatever was not core to the government, what is considered not important of strategic interest for the government to be controlling closely, and put it out there in the private domain. The historical examples, when you look at Hindustan Zinc, you look at Balco, has been tremendous increase in returns for these entities. And our thought was that to make this country get much faster, accelerate its growth, it would make sense for the areas where the government need not be involved and where it can move much faster and more efficiently to actually move that to the private sector. Yes, that has other implications on the fiscal deficit, because non-tax revenue reduces our fiscal deficit. But the main concern was not this 3.5% or 3.8%. It was to bring much greater efficiencies to the Indian economy and start making the Indian economy move significantly faster in its growth trajectory to catch up with people that have left us behind because of their faster ability to make decisions in a big way. With that, I will hand over, over to the next speaker,